They laughed quietly during the vows, the kind of laughter meant to wound without being heard. I felt it in the stillness beside me, in the way my husband's hand tightened just once around mine. The truth was already in the room, waiting for the right moment to speak. The wedding took place on a cold afternoon, in a small hall that smelled faintly of candles and winter coats. I stood there in a simple dress, older than most brides, marrying a man who carried his past lightly and his silence carefully. My son and his wife sat in the second row, smiling politely, their eyes holding something harder underneath. I told myself love didn't need approval, but silence has a way of remembering everything. The room was quiet in the way churches get quiet before a promise is spoken. Not empty, just waiting. Light came in through the tall windows at an angle, pale and winter soft, catching dust in the air like it had nowhere else to be. The candles along the aisle flickered once.
And so,
settled.
while we
Somewhere
celebrate
behind
this
me,
union,
a coat brushed
it's
against
also a
wooden
time
pew.
for truth.
The sound lingered longer than it should have. I stood at the altar, my hands folded, my heart steady in a way that surprised me. That was when I saw my son lean toward his wife. He didn't turn his whole body, just enough. A small movement. Familiar. The kind of movement he used to make as a boy when he wanted to say something clever without getting caught. His mouth curved into a smile that wasn't meant for me. Or for love. It was quick. Sharp around the edges. His wife covered her mouth as she laughed. Quietly. Polite enough to pass as nothing. Their whispers moved between them like cold drafts. You couldn't hear the words, but you felt where they landed. I kept my eyes forward. Beside me, my husband stood still. Not rigid. Just settled. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands resting loosely in front of him. He looked exactly where he was supposed to look, at the officiant, at the space beyond, at the future we were naming out loud. If he noticed the whispers, he didn't show it. The officiant cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice echoed softly, filling the room in a careful way, like he knew not to rush. Each word seemed to hover before landing. Love. Commitment. Patience. Words meant to cover a lot of ground. I listened, but my attention kept drifting back to the second row. To my son's posture. To the way his knee bounced once, twice, before settling. To the confidence of someone who believes he understands the full picture. I wondered when that started. When my child began thinking he already knew how stories end. The air felt cooler near my feet. I shifted my weight slightly, the fabric of my dress whispering against the floor. It was a simple dress. No lace. No train. Just something that felt honest. Something that didn't ask to be admired. My husband had liked it the first time he saw it. He'd said, "That looks like you." And that had been enough. Another small laugh came from the second row. Softer this time. My son leaned back, his face smoothing into something neutral, something respectful. Anyone watching casually would have missed it. But I didn't miss it. I thought of all the years I'd sat in rooms pretending not to hear things. Of dinners where words were shaped carefully, sharpened quietly. Of learning how silence could be used like a tool. The officiant paused, then smiled at us. "Do you take?" My husband answered without hesitation. "I do." His voice was even. Low. The kind of voice that didn't reach for attention. It carried the calm of someone who had said harder things before. I felt it then, the smallest tightening of his hand around mine. Just once. Not a plea. Not a warning. An acknowledgement. I squeezed back. From where my son sat, all he could see was an older man in a plain suit. A man who didn't fill the room with stories. Who didn't command attention with volume or charm. A man who stood quietly and let things pass over him. What my son didn't see were the years behind that stillness. The officiant continued, his words flowing like water finding its way around stones. I watched my husband's profile, the faint line near his eye, the scar along his knuckle he never talked about. Details I'd learned slowly. Patiently. Things you only see when you stop assuming. Another whisper. Another smile from the second row. This one lingered a second too long. I felt something then. Not anger. Something heavier. Something closer to grief. Not for myself. For the distance. The officiant asked me the question next. I answered, my voice steady, surprising even me. The sound of it seemed to push gently against the room, as if testing whether it would be allowed to stay. "I do." The words landed. They stayed. I looked out again just once and met my son's eyes. He smiled back, wide, practiced, public. The smile of someone who thinks the moment belongs to him as much as anyone else. I wondered what he thought he was laughing at. Age, silence, the absence of spectacle? He didn't know how carefully that silence had been earned. The officiant spoke the final lines, his tone warm, his cadence slow. When he declared us married, the room responded with applause, measured, appropriate, polite. Chairs creaked. Coats shifted. Someone dabbed at their eyes. My husband turned to me then. He smiled. Not broadly. Not performatively. Just enough to soften his face. His eyes held mine, steady and clear, like he was making sure I was still there. Behind us, applause continued. In the second row, my son clapped too. Slower now. Thoughtful. His wife leaned in again, but this time she didn't laugh. I didn't know yet what would be said later, or how the truth would surface, as truths often do, without asking permission. All I knew in that moment was this. The man beside me had stood through judgment before, and my son had no idea who he had just underestimated. The applause came gently, like rain that didn't intend to stay. Hands clapped, chairs shifted. Someone laughed too quickly, then stopped. When it ended, the quiet didn't rush away. It lingered, unsure of what it was allowed to do next. We stepped down from the altar together. My heel caught slightly on the edge of the carpet, and my husband steadied me without looking, his hand already there as if he'd been waiting for the moment. His palm was warm. Steady. The kind of warmth that doesn't need to announce itself. People stood. Smiles opened and closed. Arms reached for us in turns. Careful hugs, polite congratulations, phrases practiced enough to sound sincere. Beautiful ceremony, Dad, I'm so happy for you. You look lovely. I thanked them all. I meant it. But my eyes kept moving, the way they do when something underneath hasn't settled yet. The reception room smelled like coffee and winter coats drying too fast. White tablecloths stretched tight over round tables, corners clipped just right. Candles burned low in glass holders, their flames bending whenever someone passed too close. A violin played softly from the corner, the notes thin and careful, like they didn't want to intrude. Laughter rose and fell in short bursts. Not the kind that fills a room. The kind that checks first to see if it's welcome. My husband stood beside me, nodding when spoken to, smiling politely, saying thank you when it was his turn. He didn't move much. Didn't fidget. He let the room come to him and pass on. I noticed people watching him when they thought he wouldn't notice. Measuring. Guessing. I recognized that look. Near the bar, my son stood with his wife, holding 2 glasses he hadn't touched yet. He watched us approach, his face already arranging itself into something light. Friendly. Easy. Mom, he said, kissing my cheek. You did great. His wife smiled too. A smile that stayed on her lips, but didn't reach anywhere else. Then my son turned to my husband. So, he said, lifting his glass slightly, this is my mom's new husband. He's, just retired. The words landed softly. Too softly. As if they were meant to disappear before anyone could question them. Just retired. Final. Complete. Enough to explain everything and nothing at all. I felt the space around us change. A small tightening, like a thread being pulled somewhere behind the scenes. My husband nodded once. That's right, he said. Nice to meet you. His voice was calm. Neutral. He extended his hand. My son shook it, quick and firm, already turning his attention elsewhere. Conversation moved on. Someone asked about the weather. Someone mentioned the drive. The violin shifted into another song. But I stayed still. I watched my husband's face. The way he accepted the label without correcting it. The way he didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. He simply stood there, his hands resting loosely at his sides, as if he trusted the quiet to do its own work. People drifted away in pairs and small groups. Glasses clinked too loudly when they met. A chair scraped the floor, then scraped again as someone tried to fix it. I leaned in slightly. You okay? I asked. He smiled at me. A small one. Honest. I'm fine, he said. And I believed him. Still, I watched the room. I watched how a woman at the far table paused mid-sip when she overheard the word retired. How a man near the window glanced at my husband's hands, then away. How conversations skimmed along the surface of safe topics, travel plans, recipes, the cost of flowers, never dipping deeper than necessary. It wasn't unkind. It was careful. Careful can hurt in quieter ways. My son laughed at something his wife whispered. This time, the laugh sounded unsure, like it hadn't decided whether it meant what it said. He glanced back at us, just briefly, as if checking whether we'd noticed. We had. My husband reached for a glass of water and took a slow sip. The ice clicked once against the side, sharp in the hush between notes of music. He set it down exactly where he'd picked it up. Silence followed him like a shadow. I realized then how used he was to being underestimated. How practiced he was at letting people finish their assumptions without interruption. It wasn't weakness. It was restraint. The kind you learn when correcting people costs more than it gives. A guest approached us. An older man with a careful posture and eyes that lingered too long. He shook my husband's hand and said, "So, retirement treating you well?" My husband nodded. "It has its moments." The man smiled, satisfied, and moved on. I wanted to say something. To open my mouth and let the truth spill out, bright and undeniable. To correct the room before it settled into its version of us. But my husband met my eyes and gave the slightest shake of his head. Not now. So I stayed quiet. Across the room, my son lifted his glass again, this time watching us more closely. His smile had thinned. He looked thoughtful, curious. The applause had faded. The laughter had softened. What remained was something heavier, slower, gathering its shape. I felt it in my chest. Whatever my son thought he had just defined, whatever story he believed he'd closed with two simple words, wasn't finished. Not yet. The room grew quieter as the evening settled into itself. Not empty, just softer around the edges. Most of the guests had drifted toward the windows or the bar by then, pulled by music and movement. Our table sat slightly apart, near the far wall where the light from the candles didn't quite reach. The tablecloth there was wrinkled, like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. My husband sat across from me, his chair angled just enough to face the room without inviting it in. He picked up his napkin and smoothed it once. Then again. His fingers moved along the edge, slow and careful, as if he were following a familiar route on a map only he could see. Outside, snow had begun to fall. At first it was barely noticeable, just a few pale flecks drifting past the windows. Then more followed. The glass softened. The world beyond blurred into quiet. He didn't look up right away. "People decide fast," he said finally. His voice was low. Not bitter. Just observant. Like someone naming the weather. "They usually do," I said. He nodded. His thumb paused at the corner of the napkin, pressing it flat. "They decide who you are before they ever ask where you've been." I watched his hands. The way they rested. The way they didn't fidget or rush. Hands that had learned patience from necessity. "They're not always wrong," he added. "Just incomplete." The violin had stopped playing. In its place, there was the quiet clink of silverware, the murmur of conversations trying to sound lighter than they felt. Someone laughed near the doorway. Someone else dropped a fork and apologized too many times. I leaned back slightly, listening. He traced the napkin again. This time slower. More deliberate. "There were years," he said, "when I didn't come home much. I already knew this. Not the details, but the shape of it. The way absences leave outlines long after they're over." He didn't elaborate. He never did unless asked, and even then only in pieces. "I thought distance would make things easier," he said. "Turns out it just makes them heavier to carry." I thought of the fragments he had shared with me over time. Late nights. Early mornings. Work that followed him home even when he tried to leave it outside. Phone calls he didn't answer in front of me, not out of secrecy but respect. Names he never said aloud. Not because they were forbidden. Because they were finished. I reached across the table and touched his hand. He stopped tracing the napkin and let his fingers rest under mine. Across the room, my son stood with his wife, their heads bent together. He glanced over at us, then looked away quickly, as if he'd been caught staring at something he didn't understand. I wondered what version of this moment he saw. Did he see an older man sitting quietly at a table, saying little, offering nothing impressive to hold on to? Did he see a mother who had settled? Or did he see nothing at all, just empty space filled with assumptions? My husband followed my gaze. He didn't need to ask who I was looking at. "He doesn't know me," he said gently. "No," I said. "He doesn't." "That's okay," he replied. "Most people don't. They know the outline, not the weight." He smiled then. Not with humor. With acceptance. Snow pressed harder against the windows now, muting the sound of passing cars, softening the edges of the night. The world outside felt distant, wrapped in something forgiving. Inside, the room felt exposed. I thought about the stories people tell themselves when they're missing pieces. How easily silence gets filled with whatever fits best. My son laughed again, louder this time. Too loud. I saw his shoulders stiffen right after, like he'd noticed it too. Something was shifting. Subtly. Like ice adjusting before it cracks. My husband leaned back in his chair and finally looked at the room fully. Not scanning. Not measuring. Just present. You know, he said, I used to correct people. When they got it wrong. I raised an eyebrow. And it never changed what they wanted to believe. He shrugged slightly. So I stopped. His napkin lay folded now, the edges finally still. What changed? I asked. He met my eyes. Held them. I met someone who saw me without asking for proof. The words settled between us, heavy and warm at the same time. A server approached with a small smile and asked if we needed anything. We both shook our heads. She lingered a moment, as if expecting more, then moved on. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Across the way, my son's wife whispered something to him. This time he didn't smile. He just nodded slowly, his eyes still on us. I wondered what story he thought he was mocking earlier. Did he imagine an ending already written? A life summarized too quickly? A man reduced to a single, convenient label? Just retired. My husband stood then, smoothing his jacket once. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. I'm going to get some air, he said. I'll come with you, I replied. He shook his head gently. I'll be right outside. I watched him walk toward the doors. The way people stepped aside without realizing it. The way the room seemed to quiet as he passed, not because he demanded it, but because presence has its own gravity. He paused at the door, one hand resting on the handle, and looked back at me. Not worried. Not uncertain. Grounded. The snow beyond the glass fell steadily now, thick and patient. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, watching my son watch the door my husband had just stepped through. For the first time that evening, my son didn't look amused. He looked curious. And curiosity, I knew, was the beginning of everything that comes next. The toast began the way most toasts do, with a chair scraping back, a glass lifted, a smile that wanted to keep things light. The man stood near the center of the room, one hand steadying his drink, the other tucked into his jacket like he wasn't sure what to do with it. His voice carried easily, practiced from years of speaking just loud enough to be heard without asking permission. He started with the easy memories: weather, travel, how good the cake was. People laughed at the right places. The sound rose and fell like it had rehearsed. I watched my husband from the corner of my eye. He had returned from outside a few minutes earlier, a faint chill still clinging to his coat. Snow had followed him in, melting slowly near his shoes, leaving small dark shapes on the floor. He stood beside me, hands folded again, his attention on the speaker, but his expression unreadable. The man paused, glanced down at his glass, then looked back up. There are some people, he said, who don't like attention, but their absence always seems louder than most people's presence. The room quieted. Not completely, just enough to notice itself. And there are names, he continued, that carry more than sound. They carry years. I felt it then, a shift, like the room had leaned forward without realizing it. He said the name carefully, clearly, without embellishment. A name my son hadn't heard in decades. It didn't come wrapped in nostalgia or softened by humor. It came with respect. The way you say a name when you know it belongs to something earned. I watched my son's face change. The smile he'd been wearing slipped away, slow and unmistakable. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition struggling to surface. He looked at the speaker, then at my husband, then back again. The room felt different now, as if the walls had moved closer. My husband lifted his head. For the first time that day, he looked directly at my son. Not defiantly, not proudly, just openly. Their eyes met. I saw something pass between them. Too fast to name, too heavy to ignore. My husband didn't straighten his posture or lift his chin. He didn't claim the moment. He simply allowed it to exist. The speaker went on unaware, or maybe fully aware, of what he'd just done. I worked with him years ago, the man said. Back when doing the right thing didn't always look impressive. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone shifted in their seat. Someone else cleared their throat. My son's wife leaned toward him, whispering urgently now. He didn't answer her. His eyes were still on my husband, on the man he'd labeled too quickly, the man who had stood quietly through every assumption. The toast ended not with laughter, but with applause that felt different from before. Slower, more deliberate, like people were clapping for something they hadn't known they were witnessing. The speaker raised his glass once more, nodded toward us, and sat down. Silence followed. Not awkward, intentional. My husband exhaled softly. I felt it before I heard it. My son stood. He didn't lift a glass. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, as if his body had decided before his mind caught up. "I didn't know," he said finally. The words were quiet. "Bear." My husband didn't rush to answer. "That's okay," he said after a moment. "You weren't supposed to." My son swallowed. His hands clenched, then relaxed. He nodded once, as if testing the motion. "I'm sorry," he said. Not loudly. Not publicly. Just enough. My husband nodded in return. No forgiveness speech. No correction. Just acknowledgement. The tension didn't snap. It eased. Slowly. Carefully. Conversation resumed in fragments. A chair moved. A server refilled glasses. The violin began again, hesitant at first, then finding its rhythm. But the room wasn't the same. Names had weight now. Silence had context. My son sat back down, his posture different, his eyes unsettled in a way I recognized. The way people look when a story they believed has been rewritten without asking them. He glanced at me. Then away. My husband reached for my hand and held it. His thumb brushed my knuckle once, grounding. Later, as guests began to gather their coats, my son approached us again. Slower this time. Without his wife beside him. "I should have asked," he said. "Before." My husband smiled. Not with his eyes. With patience. "There's time," he said. "If you want it." My son nodded, the movement small but sincere. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The world looked clean. Quiet. Like it had been given a chance to start again. As we stepped toward the door, I looked back once more at the room where names had changed everything. I knew then that the past hadn't come forward to demand anything. It had come forward to be seen. And sometimes, that's enough to change what comes next. The room emptied the way winter rooms do. Slowly, politely, as if no one wanted to be the last sound left behind. Coats were lifted from chair backs. Scarves were wrapped twice, then adjusted again. Goodbyes were exchanged in low voices, softened by the hour and by something no one named. The candles had burned down to short, wavering stubs. Wax pooled at their bases, hardened where it had dripped and cooled too quickly. My husband stood near the door with me, his coat folded over his arm. He looked tired in a quiet way. Not worn down. Just ready to leave the day where it belonged. Outside, snow had started again, thin flakes drifting down like they weren't in a hurry to arrive. I thought that would be the end of it. A closing. A clean enough line. Then my son approached. He didn't come all the way at first. He stopped a few steps away, as if unsure whether he was interrupting or being invited. His hands were empty now. No glass. No phone. Just him standing there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't look at me right away. He started, then stopped. The word hung there unfinished. My husband didn't move. He didn't step forward or turn away. He simply waited, the way people do when they're willing to hear whatever comes next. My son cleared his throat. "I didn't know where to stand," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, not yet. But it was closer than we'd been all evening. My husband nodded once. "That's all right," he said. The simplicity of it seemed to loosen something. My son looked up then, meeting his eyes fully this time. There was no defiance there. No humor. Just uncertainty. "I shouldn't have," he stopped again, his jaw tightening briefly. "I shouldn't have assumed." My husband listened. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He didn't soften it with reassurance or sharpen it with truth. He let the words exist as they were. "That happens," he said finally. "More than people think." My son nodded, his shoulders dropping slightly, like he'd been holding them up all evening without realizing it. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Not to me. To my husband." My husband smiled. Not broadly. Just enough. "So am I," he replied. That was it. No speeches. No reckoning. No need to make the moment larger than it was. My son stepped back, gave me a quick, tentative hug, and walked away to find his wife. She glanced at us once, her expression unreadable, then turned back to him. The door closed behind the last guest with a soft, final sound. We stood there for a moment longer, listening to the room settle into itself. The violin case leaned against the wall, closed now. A single napkin lay forgotten on one of the tables, folded carefully as if someone had meant to come back for it. My husband slipped his coat on and reached for my hand. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," I said. The night outside was cold but gentle. Snow crunched under our shoes as we walked to the car. The streetlights cast pale circles on the road, each one disappearing behind us as we passed through it. Inside the car, the heater hummed quietly. We drove without music, without conversation. The windshield wipers moved in a steady rhythm, brushing snow aside, then doing it again. I watched the road unwind ahead of us. After a while I spoke. You didn't have to be so patient. He glanced at me, then back to the road. Yes, he said. I did. That was all. The snow thickened as we left the town behind. Trees lined the road, their branches heavy and still, like they were listening too. The world felt smaller in the way it does when weather decides the pace. I thought about the moment earlier, the name spoken, the shift it caused. How truth sometimes enters a room quietly, without asking to be believed. It hadn't arrived to impress anyone or to prove anything. It had arrived because it was time. My son had seen a glimpse of it, just enough to unsettle the story he'd been telling himself. Whether he would sit with that discomfort or turn away from it, I didn't know. People choose what they carry forward. The car turned onto our street. Our house came into view, its porch light glowing warmly against the snow. It looked exactly as it always had. Familiar. Steady. We pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment before getting out. Snow tapped softly against the windshield. I'm glad you didn't say anything, I told him. He nodded. Sometimes, he said, silence does the work better. Inside, the house was quiet and welcoming. I hung up my coat, smoothed my dress once before changing, then paused. The fabric felt different now. Lighter. We moved through the room slowly, turning off lights, leaving one lamp on near the window. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering footprints almost as soon as they were made. Before going to bed, I stood by the window and looked out once more. The world was blanketed, softened, forgiving. I wondered if my son would ever fully understand what kind of man he had mocked. Not the name, not the history, but the restraint, the patience, the choice to let truth arrive on its own. I turned off the light and followed my husband down the hall. Behind us, the house settled, quiet and complete, holding what had been said, and what hadn't, exactly where it belonged.